Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with George Ryan and Jack Woods, who are both consultants with us at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today we're going to be talking about identity and access management. So the first question I have for you guys is, what exactly is identity and access management, and does it just cover sort of employees?
Yeah, so identity and access management is really about the who's who and who can access what within the organization. So the main kind of principle of it is, one, that actually this is someone in the organization or with the ability to view data, and two, for the data they're looking to access, are they actually allowed to do so? In terms of it being just employees, so it's beyond that. So, for example, you have contractors, your third parties. So, for example, a lot of organizations will have a MSP. So, you've got your third party IT, and your access management needs to cover them as well. You want to kind of be sure that they are allowed to access what you allow them to access. You don't want them having unprecedented access, for example.
Other kind of examples of that would be if you're working with an organization like URM, for example. Oftentimes clients give us access to a specific area within their Google Workspace or SharePoint, and those access controls are restricted so that we can only kind of edit the documents that we're adding, that kind of stuff, rather than just they give us access to that slither and then we can then go and find out some other stuff. That's generally not how it works. Sometimes that happens, and then we tell them that there's an issue. But on most occasions, it's largely they give us a partition and we'll use that to kind of share information with them.
Great, thank you guys. So just at a high level, how does it work?
So I guess the first thing to do is kind of split it into its words, which is identity and then access management. So, for example, if we take Dave from accounts, we want to know that it is Dave from accounts who is the person claiming to be the person. But then we actually want to see, okay, what is Dave from accounts looking to access? Because Dave from accounts can access accounts, that's fine. But we don't actually want Dave to be able to access HR information potentially. So with that, we want to be able to prove who they are, but then actually control what that person is able to then view.
Yeah, and it's the life cycle of that person, because Dave from accounts may then move into HR, and then you would say, okay, well, we need to potentially raise a request internally, send it to IT and say this person's access rights need to change from finance to HR, and then they will only have access to the HR stuff and no longer have access to the finance. So it's the entire life cycle that needs to be covered here. It's the kind of creation, the use, the kind of modification of those access rights, because it may be that when Dave starts at the organization, he's in finance and he's pretty low level, and then as he progresses his career, he gets more and more access because he needs those privileged access rights to be able to carry out tasks. And so it's making sure that access is based on the needs of the user, so they don't go beyond what they need it for. So it's kind of need to use, need to know, least privilege level of access. And the reason for the control is for verification, traceability. You want to make sure that if there is an issue, that it can be traced back to a user account, whether it's someone impersonating that user or not. You will know that it's that user account, and then you can have the conversation to say, have you been phished? What's been going on? But you can always then lead it back to that account. Sometimes organizations run into a bit of issue when you have service accounts. So if multiple people can access a singular account identity, it can make it a little bit more difficult in terms of traceability to kind of work out who was using that account at that time. But generally, the reason for identity management is that verification, traceability, audit trail of that user's activities.
I guess off the back of that as well, it's quite interesting to think if we take an employee that's been somewhere for 20 years, the amount of permissions, etc., that they can accumulate. If that account gets breached, you might not even be aware where that account can go and what they can do.
Yeah. So what we when we see that, it's generally called kind of privilege creep or access creep. It's the person's been there that long that they've moved around a little bit, so they've still got access to all of these different areas of the business where they don't really need access. You tend to find it a lot in startup organizations that then grow quite quickly. The people that were involved at kind of executive level that were managing potentially 3 or 4 different hats, wearing 3 or 4 different hats, then potentially fail to segregate themselves from those hats, and they still have access to each of those areas. And so it makes you a really good target for a malicious actor. If they want to try and get that level of access quite quickly, they might look at those people because there's potential that they're going to have a wider range of access than just someone that's joined the organization recently and is a general user. Sometimes organizations struggle to protect authentication information. Sometimes organizations send usernames and passwords in the same emails, that kind of thing. That's not what we want to be doing. We want to be making sure that those credentials are communicated kind of separately so that there's no ease of access. And then the further step beyond that is the use of multi-factor authentication. So using an authenticator app or enabling single sign-on within your organization so that if someone has signed in, it means that it's going to sign in their accounts and they don't have to go through the MFA process every single time. It's more for ease. It's efficient to have SSO, and the MFA is that additional kind of security layer on top of that.
Great, thanks, guys. So you've sort of looked at SSO and MFA there. What other components might feature?
Yeah, so I think kind of a big one with your identity and access management, which we kind of alluded to earlier, is having something in place for those that are joining, those that are moving, and those that are leaving the organization. And what a lot of companies do is they do automate some of these parts, so it's less kind of stress on IT, and that's kind of a repetitive process. But essentially, when someone's joining, this is a perfect opportunity to assess what they need permissions to, what they need to access, what tools potentially. And you can do what's known as kind of RBAC, which is role-based access control, for example. It might be a case of, we just hired someone within HR. We need to give them the HR profile, which means they'll have access to all the HR information. We don't need them to be accessing the same stuff as someone who's working in development, software development. Once we get to the moving, like Jack said as an example, people move departments. So this person might then move from HR to finance. And then it's a case of, okay, let's do a little assessment here. Do they still need access to the HR information? Okay, no, they don't. Right. Put them on a finance profile. And then obviously you've got the leaving. So when someone does leave, what you don't want is them to still have access, weeks, months, years down the line. And that is something that we've seen in the news before with cyber breaches, and actually it's inactive accounts that they weren't actually aware that still did have access. So you've got to be kind of really careful with your accounts and where you leave them, etc. And it's one of those that I guess one of the big concerns is that even a former employee logs in and they've still got the access, they've got all the emails coming in. Potential business email compromise, loads more that can stem from that.
And in terms of those temporary user accounts, kind of like you've mentioned there, George, and when we go into organizations and things like that, often what organizations do as an additional layer is that they will put a time frame on that account. So they may say that account can only remain active for 30 days or 60 days. And so if they were to forget, hopefully they don't, but if they were to forget, it should limit the exposure in terms of how long that person will have access for. And I think the key thing for all of this is the reviews. It's part of the requirements of the control from 27001 access rights need to be regularly reviewed. So making sure that those rights are reviewed on a pretty regular basis will help enable kind of removal of access should it be required for people that have left or they've changed their job role. Some access needs to be revoked. They need to have the additional access kind of added. So those regular reviews make it a lot easier to manage. And the other part of that is having clear definitions for roles, because if roles don't have clear definitions, there's scope for someone to say, well, I need to do this as part of my role, but actually that role has come from a requirement that someone else has asked them to do something and they don't have access. It's not necessarily part of their role, so they may only need temporary access to that file or to that document so that they can do what they need to do in it, and then that access should be removed. So it's making sure that you set timeframes if it's a temporary access account. If you're raising access requests in ticketing systems, that those tickets have deadlines on them to say this person is leaving on this date, so we need to kind of conduct the exit checklist prior to this date to make sure that everything has come back, we've got their device back, all of the access has been kind of terminated, that kind of stuff. Making sure that that's clearly defined is probably one of the best ways that you can make sure that access rights are managed effectively.
Great, thank you guys. So next one for you to consider, why are privileged accounts one of the biggest security risks, and how should organizations manage them?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question. It's privileged access or privileged accounts generally have ability to kind of make sweeping changes, access sensitive data, or disable controls. So you want to make sure that they're the most restricted or kind of tightly controlled and monitored, because they are probably the biggest target for a malicious kind of threat actor to try and gain access. They'll want to look for those people that will probably have privileged accounts. And I mentioned it earlier, when you've got a small organization and you've got people wearing multiple hats, there's potential that they're going to have privileged accounts. And so what you need to do is make sure that those privileged accounts are segregated from their regular user accounts. And that's what often organizations will do, is they'll have a regular user account for that person and then a privileged user account for that same person. And they should only really be using that privileged user account when they need to be doing things that require those permissions. They shouldn't be using their privileged user account for general day-to-day working, because that increases the exposure of that account to potentially external people. So they need to make sure that that's something that's being done in your organization. It's when you've got those privileged access accounts, making sure that they're only used when they need to be used rather than used for day-to-day tasks. You can use solutions for that. So you can have privileged access management solutions or session monitoring to try and limit misuse or any kind of compromise. But generally, what you want, the main procedural aspect of that is that staff are made aware that they should be using their general user account for day-to-day activity.
And what does secure authentication look like in practice today, and why is MFA so important?
Yeah, so I think the big thing with secure authentication is just making it that little bit kind of harder and adding those extra steps. So, for example, a common one we see, which is relatively easy and cheap to implement, is multi-factor authentication. And that is having some kind of combined something you know, something you are, something you have. So you know your password, you have your phone, something you are, biometrics. That could be your thumbprint, that could be your face scan as such. But essentially what it does is it's just turning authentication into something that's just that little bit more complex. So if you get exposed to phishing, they have your username and password. Well, actually, they need to go one step further, and potentially they need, for example, a push notification that you have. Equally, you can have pass keys. You can have physical pass keys that you have on your laptop. With Windows 11 machines, I think TPM is now the standard. So again, it's getting into cryptographic keys. Further, you have certificate-based authentication. which we see in quite a lot of enterprise environments. But really, the whole secure authentication is just taking your typical username and password and just upping that level of security, really making it a bit harder for the attacker to move anywhere as such. Obviously, that does come with limitations. So, I think as everyone is aware, whilst MFA is fantastic, that doesn't mean it's bulletproof. So you may use MFA, but actually sometimes it still keeps tokens. People can then use that token and bypass your MFA. Just because we have it doesn't mean we're completely secure, which is why it's only a component of our wider security. Nothing in security is 100% on its own, which is why we need the holistic kind of take.
And the other thing to consider as well is that when we talk about secure authentication, organizations are moving towards a scenario where if you try to log in and you've got the username or the password wrong, you can make it so that when it comes up with the error message, it doesn't tell you which part of that kind of those credentials is wrong. It will just say that either the username or password is incorrect. And so that puts a bit of kind of pressure back on the person that's potentially trying to use that to gain malicious access, because they might not necessarily know which credential is inaccurate. So it forces them to kind of either rethink it or just move on and try someone else.
So looking towards the future now, what problems do you think could arise?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is going to be around how you govern your usage of artificial intelligence. So what we're seeing, which is fantastic, is that we can automate some of the easier tasks with artificial intelligence, and it can kind of replace the kind of manual, boring tasks that no one wants to do, so we can do the fun stuff. But what we may not consider is actually when we're implementing artificial intelligence is what are we giving it access to? So, for example, if it's got access to our whole mailbox, it can therefore see all emails. Potentially, do we want to govern it and actually have it so it's set up and it can access emails except for the ones that we've got marked as confidential? So, example of that is Microsoft Copilot. And again, this is where our IAM, our access management, feeds into the wider kind of cybersecurity framework. So what you can do, for example, is you can have sensitivity labels on documents, items, etc. And you can configure your AI in a way that for something that's just internal usage, your AI can see it, it can amend it. But for something that's confidential, it will actually go back to you and say, I can't view this document. I cannot amend this. I don't have the access to it. So I think ultimately with the implementation of AI is that organizations need to be aware, are they effectively handing it keys to the kingdom without realizing as such? I think we've already seen examples with kind of APIs and organizations just not being aware where actually they didn't realize that all of their information was accessible to the AI. And potentially what that means is you can have the accidental disclosure, or an attacker might make use of that and get in through your AI that you're implementing.
Yeah, and another consideration might be as well where you're using AI or automation to manage access is if you use access groups, and so you give people permissions based on those access groups, something to consider might be that if that access needs to be amended for one individual, you need to make sure that that doesn't change the access group permission so that it changes for everyone that's got that group. It should only change for that individual. And then you can use AI to kind of help with the review of those access rights. So you can make sure that it's checking for excessive access rights, dormant accounts, privilege creep. You can make sure that if there's any kind of impossible travel, so someone's logged in from, I don't know, Venezuela, and they were logged in from the UK an hour ago, you can make sure that any AI tool that you're using can identify that and pick that up and let you know that actually someone's trying to gain access. So it is useful, but like George says, there's a lot of caveats to that at the moment.
Yeah, which I guess it's like any new technology you introduce to an organization, isn't it? It's anything you're introducing which is new and has new access is therefore an extension of your security and must be treated as such.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. If anyone wants to read up a little bit more about this topic, we've got a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called ISO 27001-2022 A5 Organizational Controls Access Management, which covers a lot of what we've spoken about today and sort of goes off in some other areas as well. If anyone would like to ask Jack and George a question in a future episode, there'll be a link in the description to this episode, which you can, if you click on that link, it will take you to a form. You can just enter your question there and we'll receive that. Or you can just pop your question in the comments. So thanks very much, guys, for talking to me today. And thank you, everyone, for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.